Welcome to another presentation where we're looking at the prophecy of Isaiah. This is presentation 35, and I've entitled this God's Invitation. Let's just briefly look back at the previous presentation. We saw that the people of Israel, God had brought them into existence, He'd protected them, He'd given them clear instructions for quality lifestyles which enriched their lives, and He gave them a strategic land from which they could reach out and bless and touch people groups round about. That was their role. To live a quality of life that reflected God Himself, and that's the best kind of life we could possibly have. And by doing that, to share their understanding of God with the people groups round about. Sadly, they failed. But it's revealed to Isaiah what is the answer. God's answer. Human frailty had failed. The answer lay in the suffering servant king. An amazing insight. God would enter our humanity as a suffering servant. And this suffering servant king would win victory by allowing himself to be destroyed. What an amazing paradox. And we see, of course, that Jesus was humiliated and tortured to death, and He did it willingly. And He didn't retaliate or try to retaliate in any way. In all of this, God allowed Jesus to be utterly humiliated. Because suffering this way robbed evil of its power to control us. It broke the power of evil, and it broke the power of human rebellion so that humans could be set free. What a radical idea. Success comes through suffering and failure. It was utterly revolutionary in the days of Isaiah, and most didn't get it. It is still utterly revolutionary today. And it's a message that Jesus came and lived out. And it's a message that the people of God today, we have got to face up to and rethink the way we do things. We saw in the last presentation the work of the suffering servant. Isaiah describes it vividly. Now that leads on to the next two chapters, where relationships can be restored with God, but it requires our response, and it leads to lifestyle changes. Now that's the general focus of chapters 54 and 55, which we'll look at together. What an amazing insight Isaiah brings. God entered our humanity, and by allowing Himself to be defeated, He broke the power of evil, He broke the power of human rebellion. And we can enter into a new relationship. A relationship with God that allows us to reach our full potential as human beings. But we have to respond. We're free, the choice is ours, to enjoy this new quality of living with a deep inner security. But it requires our response. Now in chapters 54 and 55, Isaiah paints this picture poetically, vivid poetry, metaphoric poetry. Don't try to interpret this literalistically. It wasn't written that way, and it wasn't designed that way, and it will lead to utter confusion. He paints a series of vivid pictures. The first one looks from the perspective of a family and children, but from the wife's viewpoint. He then looks at it from the picture of a city damaged by storm, now restored and thriving. In a lifestyle where the provision of food and drink were critical to survival in subsistence farming, the metaphor of the provision of food and drink, which comes from the successful harvest. But at the center of it is that in order for us to enjoy what God has for us, there is a call for human response. Now we're going to start by looking at that central focus, and then we'll look at the four beautiful poetic metaphoric pictures that Isaiah gives us. Human response. Isaiah writes that, seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their ways, and the unrighteous their thoughts. Let them turn to the Lord, and he will have mercy on them, and to our God, for he will freely pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Here is an invitation to a bright future, only possible because of what the suffering servant king was prepared to go through for humanity. The central role is Jesus. And if we rip this passage out of its context, because it derives from the pictures of 54 and 55, which follow chapters 52 and 53, which describe the work and the achievements of the suffering servant. We've got to be very careful to see it in context. But it's only there for us if we respond. And that comes from the opening words. Imperative, seek, call. God is looking for us to respond. Now that's nothing to do with intellectual knowledge and knowing more about God. It's seeking God, calling on him. And he does make himself known. But it won't last forever. It starts when we realize we have messed up. We forsake our ways. We want something better. We don't always know what the better will be, but we're looking for something better and greater. So we seek God's help. We turn to the Lord, and he's there for us. We may have messed up. We may have damaged ourselves and damaged others and damaged the world, but God's there to forgive, to restore, to make all things new. But we've got to seek him, call on him, while he may be found, while he is near. And then all that Jesus did for us as the suffering servant become real for us. God doesn't think the way we think. And God does not act the way we act. So often we picture God in our human terms and human experiences. It's hard to strip that away and to remember that God is the Lord of glory, the creator of everything. And he works to a much bigger and greater agenda. His agenda fundamentally is love. He wants the best for all humanity. And everything comes out of that. And that is true. No matter how clever we are, no matter how advanced our thinking may be, it's not God's ways and thoughts. God is a way beyond us. We've got to seek him and allow our thoughts and ways to come into line with his greater thoughts and ways. They are different, they are bigger, they are beyond us. We can summarize it this way: the center's in the call of God. We've got to be willing to respond to all that God has done for us. Now, it's nothing to do with being intellectual. It's nothing to do with achieving some kind of mental understanding of God or getting all the answers to all the questions before we'll do anything. If we seek that way, we'll never do anything because we'll never get all the answers to all the questions. And how many today resist because they want answers to questions and they just keep on putting up more questions? It avoids response. It's a cover-up. And we don't seek to respond to God on our terms. Access to God only comes through what the suffering servant king has achieved. Too often we come to God on our terms. We decide. Yet our minds are tiny compared to God. We don't think His thoughts. We don't live His way. And we can't come to God just to satisfy our desires. So often people come to say, I'll come to God, I'll respond to God, I'll do this, that and the other, if God will do. And we want Him to heal an illness, solve a family problem, direct us into a career, or into money or resources. Doesn't work that way. We come to God on His terms. And it's spiritual, not intellectual. And it's not simply to satisfy what we want. Fundamentally, it comes back to this. This is the central issue, and Isaiah has identified it so clearly. We are rebellious creatures. We think we can do it better. We know better than God. How can we come into a relationship with the God who made everything, who's holy and separate and different from us? That's the issue Isaiah is addressing. And the answer lies in the suffering servant. Now let's look at the 4 beautiful poetic pictures that Isaiah offers, because they give us insights, perspectives on this central theme of responding to God and all that the servant king has done for us. He writes, "Sing, barren woman, you who never bore a child. Burst into song, shout for joy, you who are never in labour. Because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband, says the Lord. Enlarge the place of your tent, stretch out your tent curtains wide. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords, strengthen your stakes, for you will spread out to the right and to the left. Your descendants will dispossess nations and settle in their desolate cities. Do not be afraid. You will not be put to shame. Do not fear disgrace. You will not be humiliated. Do not forget the shame of your youth, and remember no more the reproach of your widowhood." And he goes on, "For your Maker is your husband. The Lord Almighty is His name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He is called the God of all the earth. The Lord will call you back as if you were a wife deserted and distressed in spirit, a wife who married young only to be rejected, says your God. For a brief moment I abandoned you, but with deep compassion I will bring you back. In a surge of anger I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting kindness I will have compassion on you, says the Lord your Redeemer. To me this is like the days of Noah, when I swore that the waters of Noah would never again cover the earth. So now I have sworn not to be angry with you, never to rebuke you again. Though the mountains be shaken and the hills be removed, yet my unfailing love for you will not be shaken, nor my covenant of peace be removed, says the Lord, who has compassion on you." Let's look at this in 2 halves. We have to remember that in the culture of the day, having children was seen as a key blessing. There was no way to provide for people when they got old except through their children. Very practical. But having many children was seen as a blessing from God. And this is related to the experiences of God's people. Going right back to the promise made to Abraham and Sarah. Childless couple promised many descendants. Then there was the great numerical growth of God's people when they were in Egypt. Growth so fast that eventually they ended up being enslaved because they were seen as a threat. They escape from slavery and end up in the land. They grow, they multiply, they develop. But that was all set back due to their rebellion, the continual attacks of the nations and empires round about, then eventually the exile. But the picture here is of growth. Growth as more and more respond to God. The metaphor is of a family that seems to be bereft of children, suddenly bursting at the seams. This is the picture of what God wants to do for his people. And in the culture of the day, maintaining, erecting, putting up, looking after the family tent was the woman's role. And the picture here is the metaphor. You need more space, there's going to be more children, the numbers will grow. The people of God are going to multiply and grow. More space will be needed. What a wonderful picture. This is what God has for us. That we grow numerically. But God brings that growth. Not us. But our part is obedience. We respond to the call of God. We do it his way, on his terms, because he knows what's best for us. And we have a rich and full life. And there is a multiplication of those who start to follow the ways of God. Now let's look at the second part of this section. Here we have a metaphor, a picture of marriage. A marriage that faces problems. And here the picture is God being the husband of the people. God is the one who's going to look after them, protect them, provide for them. He's the Lord Almighty. He's the Holy One of Israel. He's the Redeemer, God of all the earth. And he starts by being the Creator. The picture here, the metaphor of God watching over his people. And compassion is a word that expresses God's absolute loyalty. God's agenda is your well-being and mine. His passionate concern is for the well-being of all humanity. And that's a permanent feature of God's character and nature. Anger is temporary. Compassionate love is permanent. From this picture, this metaphor, that's the point Isaiah is making. God's anger is not emotional. His anger is a kind of disappointment and hurt when his children, you and me, when we rebel. In the same way as parents get angry and distressed when they see their children rebel and do things that are wrong or foolish or dangerous. We withdraw from him by our rebellion. The Bible describes it as God hiding his face from us. Two sides of the same coin. We withdraw from him. Our relationship starts to get fractured and weakened. We no longer have the contact with him. As it were, he is hiding his face from us. And as we lose the relationship, we lose the protection that he offers to us. That's what happened to the people of Judah. They had rebelled, and rebelled. They would not listen to what the prophets were bringing to them. They removed themselves from the relationship with God. They thought they could do it better themselves, decide it for themselves. And as the protection went, they were exposed to the attacks from outside, till eventually they collapsed in the face of the onslaught of Babylon, and they went into exile. Seems a bit strange. Will God never be angry with us again? We have to remember this is poetry, this is illustration. It's a reminder of the days of Noah. Perhaps the significance is that the rebellion of the people of God, the people of Judah, nearly caused the complete dissolution of the people of God. They were taken into exile and scattered. Other people were moved into the land of Judah. Nations were being mixed up deliberately as policy to break the power of cultures that opposed Babylon. Most of the people groups, indeed all the people groups except Judah, vanished as separate people groups. They got absorbed, mixed up. But God protected the people of Judah even in exile, And they went on. And what God is promising is this: the complete disappearance of God's people will never be allowed to happen again, and history has shown that's true. Despite all the nations and empires that have conquered the land of Judah to the days of Jesus, the people of God remained as a separate people. Despite all the attacks on the followers of Jesus from the Roman Empire and all the empires that have gone on since, the followers of Jesus, we have remained, we have grown, we have developed just as Isaiah saw it would happen. We have never been totally wiped out, despite many attempts to do so. Two key words there: unfailing love and a covenant of peace. God is totally committed to you and me, his people, and he wants the best for us. And that leads to peace for us. There's an inner security. You could call it a wholesomeness of life. An inner security within us that enables us and sets us free to be effective, to be productive, to bring blessing to the societies round about. Wonderful and beautiful pictures come out of this poetry. Let's move to the second picture. The picture of a damaged city being restored and now thriving. Afflicted city, says Isaiah, lashed by storms and not comforted. I will rebuild you with stones of turquoise, your foundations with lapis lazuli. I will make your battlements of rubies, your gates of sparkling jewels, and all your walls of precious stones. All your children will be taught by the Lord, and great will be their peace. In righteousness you will be established. Tyranny will be far from you. You will have nothing to fear. Terror will be far removed. It will not come near you. If anyone does attack you, it will not be my doing. Whoever attacks you will surrender to you. See, it is I who created the blacksmith who fans the coals into flame and forges a weapon fit for its work. And it is I who have created the destroyer to wreak havoc. No weapon forged against you will prevail, and you will refute every tongue that accuses you. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord. This is their vindication from me, declares the Lord. Let's again look at the first part of this. Can you imagine the people of God? The picture, the metaphor here, the poetry. Despairing, drifting, resourceless. And the picture of transformation. It is poetry. You try to build a city with these stones that are listed there, it wouldn't be much good. It might sparkle. It's a picture, and a beautiful and wonderful picture. Spiritual wealth and security. That's what's there for us through the suffering servant. Now look at the second part. All your children will be taught by the Lord. Now, strip away from your mind all pictures of education. Schools and universities as we know them today did not exist then. Teaching was very different. Taught by the Lord. Now we get the beginnings of the clues when we look at what the result is. It comes in 4 directions. Peace, righteousness, no tyranny, no fear. Peace, let's remember, is this quiet inner security and wholesomeness. Righteousness speaks of how we treat other people, the basis of how we are judged. Tyranny, either not being dominated and not dominating. Looked at in 2 directions, both true. Tragically, in our world today, there's a lack of that. Domination is all over the place, even in democracies, and it's infiltrated the people of God in our churches. And it doesn't matter what life throws at you, and life can be very unfair and very cruel. There's a deep inner security in God. now taught by the Lord, takes on a different perspective. This is not head knowledge. It's much closer to that. As we listen to God, as we respond to them, as I has pointed out for us, as we seek His face and seek His ways, a relationship builds. We begin to understand how God does things. We begin to understand His agenda, His ways, His resources, His power. But also, we're conscious of His resources within us. And that leads to peace. That enables us to treat others the way God wants us to treat them. It removes domination. And no matter what comes at us, we have that deep inner security. All of this is a picture of what God has for us because of what the suffering servant achieved for us. Now let's look at the second half. Too often in our cultures and societies we see God sending trouble as a kind of judgment on us or as a discipline. It runs throughout our culture. Something goes wrong, and we explain it away as saying, well, we deserved it. God sent it upon us because we did or didn't. Or we see it as God kind of disciplining us. God does not work that way. That is Islamic thought. It is not the way of Jesus. Think about it for a moment. God is love. That means His agenda is the benefit of you and me all the time, no matter who we are, no matter what we've done, whether we deserve it or not, and whether we can give Him anything back. God's love, His agenda for the best, is unrestricted. God will never use disasters, problems, disease, illness, suffering, anything like that ever, because that would contradict His nature of love. These things come from other sources. There are many evil forces in the world today coming from Satan that can often cause these. God can sometimes turn them to advantage for our blessing, but He never sends them. If anyone does attack you, it will not be my doing. In God's kingdom, in the ways of Jesus, because of what Jesus has done as the suffering servant, it will not be my doing. The great theologian put it that way. It's worth pondering. We live in a fallen world where trouble comes to all people. But those who are living in obedience to the righteousness of God need not fear such trouble. It's neither a sign of retribution or discipline, but merely of the patience of God in allowing cause and effect to take its natural course. Ponder the exile of the people of Judah. It was the inevitable consequence of persistent rebellion. Isaiah makes that clear. Cause and effect. Natural course. God took the people through it and brought blessing to many because of it, but He did not send it. The evil of the Babylonian Empire brought it about, and it happened because the people of God in rebellion removed themselves from God's protection by their choice in rebellion. The English translation here has captured it rather well. See, it is I. Now, in the original, this is really emphasized. And this is a very good translation to capture that. The point is that God is in total control. God, Yahweh, the God of the people of Judah, He's the Lord of Assyria. They don't recognize Him. He's the Lord of Babylon. They didn't recognize Him either. He's the Lord of their weapons. And He even controls the blacksmith who made the weapons. God's in complete control. He's sovereign. Therefore He can protect us when these weapons are used against us. In the translation here, the word is vindication. In the original, the word actually is righteousness. And different translations have translated it as righteousness or vindication. Vindication is trying to capture something of the meaning in this particular context. Let's just reflect on that in a moment or two. Bringing this together. We, God's people, will be facing the weapons of attack from all around. You only have to talk to the followers of Jesus in Islamic lands to realize that's true. They are treated dreadfully. The people of God, the followers of Jesus in communist countries like China today, are suffering horrendously, especially their leaders. And it's beginning to grow in the West. When some jobs are no longer available to those who follow Jesus. And people are being sacked and vilified for being faithful to the ways of Jesus. But these weapons will not succeed. They will not wipe us out. They will not destroy us. They may cause problems, and the problems will be very real. And the point Isaiah is making, because of what the servant king has achieved in his humiliation and willing death, we cannot be destroyed. The weapons used against us could be physical, and there are people suffering physical torture today for being followers of Jesus. They can be verbal, spiritual, emotional, social. It could go on forever. And they can be very brutal problems. But the servant has broken the bondage of human rebellion. We're invited to respond to become God's servants in response to the servant's achievements. And God promises us that protection. The protection reflects His righteousness. He does it right. Or put another way, He will vindicate us when we are being vilified, rejected, and brutalized. Many people have used that last verse, verse 17 of this section, as personal protection, praying that as a prayer morning and night, because they know that as leaders of God's people, they are open to abuse and attack, misrepresentation and vilification. And they have taken this promise and used it as a powerful prayer to protect themselves and their loved ones when we're harassed and hassled and brutalized by those around. What a brilliant promise and a wonderful picture Isaiah has given to us. You see, the complete protection is available, but we can't do it. We've got to draw on God's resources, which is why these people have used that as a prayer. Jesus has provided the protection for us. He has defeated and broken the power of evil. Let's make that real for ourselves and bring ourselves under the protection that's available for us through Jesus' work. Now let's move on to the next part. Food and drink were essential in an agricultural society. Come, all of you are thirsty, come to the waters. And you have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, and your labour on what does not satisfy? Listen to me, and eat what is good. You will delight in the richest of fare. Give ear and come to me. Listen that you may live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you. My faithful love promised to David. See, I have made him a witness to the peoples, a ruler and commander of the peoples. Surely, in the original it says, see, you will summon nations you know not, and nations you do not know will come running to you because of the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, for he has endowed you with splendor. A whole series of imperatives. Food and water, essential parts of subsistence living. And if you don't have resources, the picture is it's all there for us. Put it this way. We have no way of solving our problems. We have no way of dealing with our human rebellion against God. But it's offered the victory for us through Jesus. We need it. It's there for us. So often we scrabble around. Endless efforts to seek for our security. I look at other religions and their adherents, and it saddens me to see all the religious activities they go through, all the rules and regulations they conform to, all the practices they carry out with great faithfulness in this endless search for spiritual security. And in the end, there is no security that way. It's available for us free. Listen to me, give ear, come to me, says Isaiah. It's all there through the work, the completed work of the suffering servant king. It's one of the sad reflections that humans, we feel that we have to do it by our own effort, and we feel that if we don't make the effort, somehow it's not real. And the idea of acknowledging that we're not capable of doing it, that we do need help, and that it is available for us free. We find that hard to stomach. Our pride gets in the way. But it's there in Jesus. Let's look at the second part. When Babylon sacked Jerusalem, it looked like the covenant between God and his people had been broken. The nation had been smashed up. The line of kings had been destroyed. The people of God had been scattered into exile. And yet Isaiah saw that a descendant in the future of David would come as the servant king. And he saw eventually this would be the suffering servant king. That the covenant would still be there. God was still there for his people, but it would be different. Great King David and this coming servant king. During the life of David, the nation, the people of God expanded. They began to enjoy peace and growth. People round about started to join them. But it was a small-scale thing compared to what's going to happen. And Isaiah pictures this coming servant king who would fulfill what the line of kings had failed to achieve. There would be a massive growth in the people of God. Now, with hindsight, we can see this. From tiny beginnings, the people of God, the followers of Jesus, grew. The Roman Empire tried to destroy them, but in the end of the day the Roman Empire fell. The people of God moved on. And various empires in the world have tried to destroy the people of God. But the people of God have moved on, grown in numbers. And despite what the media would seem to be suggesting, the numbers of people who are coming to be followers of Jesus today throughout the world is still growing steadily and rapidly. We don't see it in the West because of our rebellion. But throughout the world it's true. Isaiah was seeing something of that picture. But it goes back to God himself. It's not our cleverness or our ability. Yahweh, the God who is, and the God of relationship. You're Elohim, the great sovereign creator God, the Holy One of Israel, the one that the people of God followed. He does it because he's endowed you with splendor. In other words, when our lives start to reflect the wonder of God and his nature, others are attracted in. See, God took the initiative. He sent the servant king. We have to respond, otherwise what Jesus did for us has no meaning. And these two words capture so much of the nature of God. The Lord of glory, and yet the one who wants relationship. And we have secure living with his resources. Quality living. And when we live quality lives, we reflect God's nature to those around. And that leads to unending growth. That's what's happening in the world overall. That's God's purpose. He wants to liberate humanity and to give us rich and full lives by living his way in the kingdom. What a magnificent picture. Now the last final bit. As the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return to it without watering the earth and making it bud and flourish, so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out from my mouth, but it will not return to me empty, but will achieve what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. You, which is plural, will go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and hills will burst into song before you, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. Instead of the thorn bush will grow the juniper. Instead of briars the myrtle will grow. This will be for the Lord's renown, for an everlasting sign that will endure forever. Again, this is poetry. Vivid poetry carrying meaning. Meaning for people who lived in an agricultural society. Speaking of spiritual harvest. So often that is quoted, but in some measure misrepresented. The word translated word. This word carries the idea of God's fundamental principles and purposes. Now they're expressed by what he says, but primarily it's not just what he says. It's something behind what he says. God reveals his principles and purposes to his prophets. That comes out of his word, comes from his mouth. God shows us who he is, what his drive is, what his purposes are, and what our response should be. Now, it's nothing fundamentally to do with the biblical text. We think about it for a moment, the biblical text didn't exist at that stage. Never been collated. It's a much deeper, bigger word. Now, it encompasses the biblical text, but it's not primarily that. This passage has got a comparison, a vivid comparison between the effects of rain and the effects of God's principles and purposes working out. Rain brings physical survival. God's purposes and directions and words and revelations of the prophets bring spiritual survival. That's the key. Equally, that's the key. God has a consistent purpose that carries the idea of the word. He speaks in intelligible terms, in this case through his prophets. And his promises and purposes will always be fulfilled. Let me change spiritual survival to spiritual expansion. Let's highlight it. Lifts the whole thing up into a much bigger level, doesn't it? You see, God took the initiative. Isaiah saw it. He saw what would happen. A descendant in the far future from the line of David would come. The suffering servant king. God would enter our humanity in a human being. God sent Jesus. But we've got to respond. We can use all sorts of language for that. Trusting God, entering the kingdom. In that we learn to serve. To reflect the servant king. And it comes from understanding something about God and his nature. The God of relationship, the God who simply is, the God of creation and power. And it leads to secure living. We've got to learn to use the resources God has made available for us. And so often within our Christian communities we've lost that. And God shows himself to the world in the quality of our lives. And that's where we've gone wrong in the West. We need to learn from other countries. And that leads to growth. That's why they're growing and we're not. Basically, growth comes when we become more like Jesus. We become mirrors upon heaven, reflecting his love and his nature, and others are attracted in. What a beautiful set of pictures Isaiah has given to us. That is the prophecy of Isaiah. In the next part we're going to look at human inability.